with that, I'd like to invite Chris to take the lead here. So Chris has been contributing in so many ways to this conversation around leadership for many years, and brings a very distinct perspective. Formerly a Jesuit from the New York province of the Society of Jesus, and then eventually a managing director of JP Morgan for many years, not just in the United States, but in many regions around the world. And subsequently an author and a leading voice in this space of how our spirituality can nurture and support our maturation as leaders, and really guide the way in which we are helping to build the mission and culture of our organizations. Chris and I have had the privilege of working together over the years, and I'm really grateful for his guidance and support and mentorship. And as you'll hear, Chris's very distinct perspective, having both the corporate and the religious points of view, helps us, I think, to see some things new about the work that we're doing, and very much will touch upon and reinforce things that were part of our program, but also open up some new windows. So I hope that you'll join me in welcoming Chris as our presenter today, and we're looking forward to the conversation that continues. So Chris, thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks, David, for the kind introduction. David forgot to emphasize what he just briefly mentioned, that one of my most important credentials is that I've known him for many years and learned a lot. I start us off with a couple of scriptures. And, well, I do that for two reasons. One is to make a contrast. As David mentioned, I have religious life in my background. I was a Jesuit seminarian for a few years, and then I worked in secular professions for many years. And let me tell you this, that whatever feeling of convulsive change that you feel you're going through now, everyone feels this in every industry. And I want to point out in these scriptures that we as spiritual people have resources, actually, that those in secular professions may not have. In other words, when I worked at JP Morgan, we felt we were going through enormous change, but we couldn't really console ourselves with some scriptural belief that there was some meaning, some sense to where we were going. And so I want to remind you to take consolation in your own scriptures. And here's another thing I want to point out. This great verse from Isaiah, "See, I am doing something new. Do you not perceive it?" And my experience, I don't know about yours, is often that, yeah, for sure, I see that something is different. But I don't have this hopeful feeling that Isaiah seems to communicate. It just seems crazy and confusing and so on. And so I invite all of us to try to be anchored in this faith understanding we have about change. And now let's go to the number 3 slide, Pablo. And when I'm with a group in any industry, usually I start with this kind of slide just to see where people's sense of the world is. And I could tell you that if I invited you to start raising your hands, I suspect that if you think about the world today and the world 15 or 20 years ago, more or less everybody in the group is going to say, yes, it's much more complex. Yes, the change is more rapid. Yes, things seem to be more volatile. They swing around in one direction and another. And yes, we must make more decisions. And I guess that 90% of you probably feel this way. And I could tell you that 90% of people in investment banking felt this way, and 90% of people in healthcare. This is just the world we're all living in now. And it amused me that even though banking and healthcare are two very, very dramatically different businesses, people use the same kind of image to describe what their life often feels like. They say things like, oh, well, we feel as if we must redesign and refit our airplane while we're flying in the air. So we have this almost impossible task that we all must pull off together. And I guess many of you feel this way. And Pope Francis also feels this way. And on the fourth slide, I want to share with you this quote I enjoyed from him. And let me point out at the very bottom, he was saying this in 2013, before COVID, before so many other things that we've gone through. And I want to break this quote into two parts and make a couple of observations. First, let me read the first part and invite Fernando to read it along in Spanish as well. So the Pope is saying the defining aspect of this change of epoch is things are no longer in their place. Our previous ways of explaining the world, good and bad, no longer appears to work. And we dare not even imagine the future. That which appeared normal to us, family, church, society, will probably no longer seem that way. And let me stop there for one moment. I think he's capturing a feeling that I personally certainly recognize, a kind of imbalance. I'm old enough that when I was a young boy and a young teenager, I felt as if I could understand the world. I somehow understood how the world was unfurling. And then the world somehow became the way the Pope is describing here, and we're all a little off balance. It's not so easy to understand, much less explain how things are going. But now let me come to the next part of this quote, which I think is very important, and I want to make two observations about it. So the Pope says, we cannot simply wait for what we're experiencing to pass under the illusion that things will return to how they were before. And I think that's very important for us to hold in mind in this crazy environments in which we're trying to work. Because so basically the Pope is saying, okay, we don't understand everything. We can't see the future clearly. We don't feel great about things. But still, we must decide and move forward. And let me make two observations. One is this, that often when you're managing large organizations, in the face of such tumult, there is a temptation for people to want to hold back and say, gee, let's wait until things become clearer. And then let's move forward. Then let's make our decisions. And, you know, for one thing, it doesn't seem that things will become clearer anytime in the near future, maybe anytime in our lifetimes. And so we have the challenge that either we do nothing and our alternatives, our possible future pathways, slowly slip away from us while we're waiting. And also, let me make this observation, that sometimes the best way to go forward only becomes clear when we start on the path forward. In other words, we say, well, It's very hard to see clearly where to go, but let's try this way. And once we move for 1 month or one period of time, we begin to see either new obstacles or new indicators that help us to find the best way forward. So I want to align myself with the Pope's encouragement that he may say it from a faith perspective, I will say it from an organizational perspective. Amidst these crazy environments, we somehow need a bias to try to move forward. On the next slide, number 5, we have a much shorter encapsulation of what the Pope is talking about. The military has given us this image that we live in a world that has grown VUCA. It's volatile, it's uncertain, it's complex, and it's ambiguous. And in environments of VUCA, leadership becomes really important and leadership becomes really hard. And let me unpack both of those ideas. First, leadership becomes really important. I'm going to use a definition of leadership that's very basic, very simple, right from the dictionary. One dictionary definition of leadership is to point out a way, direction, or goal, and to influence others toward it. And if everything is very stable, if any of us can predict where the world will be in 2 years, then pointing out the way is pretty easy. Great leadership is not so imperative because even an idiot like me could say where things are going. But when things become very confusing and complex, this task of helping to point out the way and getting a group to move in one direction, that becomes really important because VUCA pulls us in all kinds of directions. And this task of pointing the way becomes, for the same reason, really, really hard. Things change too much. There's too much complexity, too much volatility. And so there's a great burden that falls on the shoulders of all of us who are called into leadership or have leadership responsibilities. And I hope that you find this very obvious. Yes, of course, when things change, leadership is hard, but sometimes we don't consciously make the connection and forgive ourselves for the burdens and difficulties that come to us and the mistakes that become natural when we're trying to lead in these environments. Now, we're all gathered together under the umbrella of trying to help lead religious congregations within the Catholic Church. And I want to point out that we have all of the same VUCA that everyone else in the world has. We have the problems that come with globalization, with rapid technological change, with societal change, and so on and so on. But we also have our own set of challenges as Catholic congregations, as Catholic organizations that are unique within the church. And we could enumerate many of those. I just want to focus on a couple of the demographic changes that particularly impact our various ministries and the way we have to operate ministries in this VUCA era. And let's go to the next slide, number 6, Pablo. And here is one simple illustration of part of the reality of change that we have to focus on as congregations. So I was a Jesuit seminarian, and I taught in a Jesuit high school in the 1980s, the early 80s. And I guess that about 1/2 of the faculty were Jesuits at that time. Now, this page depicts the reality for the Jesuits, and I guess for many of your congregations, whether in education or whatever your ministries. At the moment, around the world, there is about one Jesuit for every 50 non-Jesuits in their schools network. So in a fairly short time of history, the demographic of their ministries has completely turned upside down. And at one level, I'm sure we all experience this as a deeply invigorating moment. We're seeing all kinds of lay persons step up and show their devotion to ministry and use their gifts. But let's be frank, it also brings many challenges with it, and I will talk about those challenges in a moment. Pablo, let's go to the next slide. And I'm also, at the moment, involved in the Ministry of Healthcare. I'm the chair of the board of CommonSpirit Health, which is the largest Catholic and non-profit health system in the United States, with about 150,000 employees. And the demographic of Catholic healthcare in the United States and all over the world, like many of your ministries, has also changed dramatically. And this photos perhaps captures one dimension of this change. In the upper left, this is what Catholic healthcare looked like, literally 50, 60, 70 years ago. Part of our mission statement is that we want to make the healing presence of God known. And I guess that when a couple of sisters, women religious, came into your room 70 years ago, you literally had an image of God's healing presence. Now, our healthcare systems look much more like the bottom right. And so we have the challenge of how do we make God's healing presence palpable to people when their felt reality looks like the bottom right. The next slide, Pablo, is another dimension of this challenge that we all face. In the upper left corner is what the governance of these ministries largely looked like for much of history and up until recent decades. Women religious or men religious were the ones who ran and also governed as a board these ministries. Now in the bottom right, you see what is the governance of this healthcare ministry at present. There are a couple of women religious in this group, but most are lay people. And in fact, the whole sponsorship, the whole governance of this ministry has been transferred to a new public juridic person that acts in the role that religious congregations once acted. Now, these are all in some ways deeply hopeful changes, but I think we're crazy and not doing our jobs if we don't also think about some of the deep challenges that these present for our ministries in this new VUCA era. And Pablo, let's go to the next PowerPoint. And I'm going to read through 5 challenges that I see in my own life as a partner in Catholic ministries. And then we're going to break for our first small group discussion. And I'm going to invite you then to chat about which of these challenges you most strongly feel, and maybe some of the things you're doing about them. So as I'm going through these 5 challenges, maybe you should take note or can take note of which are the ones that most speak to you as the challenges you feel in leadership of your own congregation. So 1, how do we assess and know that we're embodying our deepest sense of mission, not just being technically competent. So in healthcare, in education, we have many metrics that indicate whether students are learning, whether people are getting healed. But how do we know and assess, in our case, that God's healing presence is really being projected and felt? Our deepest sense of mission, one kind of challenge. Second challenge, well, the women religious or Jesuits or other or Claretian or Marist founders and early leaders of all of these ministries typically had a long spiritual formation. Now, many people come to these roles, whether in governance or as head of school or as head of a hospital, with a great professional foundation. We hire them because they're spectacular teachers or principals or doctors. But what about their spiritual formation? 100 years ago, when the sisters founded many of our hospitals in the US, they would never have put one of their sister colleagues in leadership in a hospital until they were satisfied that this woman had good spiritual formation. So a second challenge, how do we take on the task of spiritually forming people who might be professionally competent? A third challenge, when these hospitals, these education systems, these various ministries had a large critical mass of religious, I think we often assumed that the culture simply happened by osmosis. I was a student at Fordham University in the late 70s and early 80s. There was no such thing as a VP of mission, as an Ignatian spirituality department. There were very few intentional programs about the Ignatian spirituality or mission. I think we all assumed, rightly or wrongly, it's just happening. But now, without this critical mass, we have our third challenge. How do we ensure that the culture takes root? In fact, we even have the challenge of what is our culture as a spiritual institute, as a congregation, insofar as it should manifest itself in our ministries. And sometimes articulating that culture in an explicit way that a lay colleague, somebody who may not even be Christian, can appreciate and embody is not so easy. Let's go to the next slide. Pablo, thank you for the last two challenges that to me come out of this reality we're living in. Here's a fourth one. The founders, early leaders of these ministries were often missionaries. As you know, in the United States, in many countries, healthcare was often founded and started by women religious who had what I call a frontier spirit. They were sent out to these sparsely populated regions of the United States, and they did what was necessary. They had a deep sense of an evolving call. I don't think they thought to themselves, oh yes, I'm going to start this little school or this little hospital, and my job will be forever to keep this school running. Rather, I guess these early founders, their idea, their spirit was, here's where I've been missioned. Let me start the ministry, but let me remain open through the voice of my congregational superiors to where the mission may evolve and whatever comes next. And now we have lay colleagues who obviously aren't bound by obedience or the call of a congregation. And so their sense of how to embody the frontier spirit, the missionary spirit of the congregation is a challenge. And finally, how do our lay colleagues not only have the spiritual formation they need, I mentioned that, but also the information they need to help lead the mission? Are their skills and insight appropriately leveraged? In other words, we may value a lay colleague who runs this school, this social service organization, this hospital. That's why we brought them to be partners with us. But as we think about our life as a congregation in the world, these experts who came to us within an individual ministry may have a lot of value to add to us as we discern as a congregation where we should be going. And are we giving them the information, that the invitation to help us do the right kind of discernment? So these are some of the challenges that I think about in my own life as a partner of a Catholic ministry. And I'm going to invite you in a couple of moments to talk about which of these challenges or other ones speak to you in your own life and journey. But before I get there, let's look at one more slide, Pablo, very quickly, just to say the obvious. Clearly, the solution to all these challenges does not lie in one master super initiative, but rather a highly intentional, integrated approach to our ministries that tries to attack these different challenges with different sorts of initiatives, all of them pulled together in a holistic way. I won't explain the dot points on these page because I know you're doing already these things in your own ministries, but I just remind us. Here is an agenda for the rest of the way for these 20 minutes. And first, let me explain it before we go through it. These ideas, how leaders need to adapt in VUCA, I would be making the same points if I'm talking to JP Morgan or IBM or Facebook or whatever. This is some general opinions about what an organization needs to do in the middle of a moment of deep change and volatility. But here's the important extra point for us in this conversation. I also want to make the point that as religious congregations, religious believers, religious institutes, we have some unique tools, unique values, unique advantages to bring to the table. In fact, in some ways, we are better off, not worse off, than these other kinds of organizations. And if I might put it this way, we have the opportunity to understand ourselves, but also to transmit to our people that there's something deeply spiritual about great leadership. And whether they're Catholic, Christian, Jewish, Hindu, atheist, they could also understand what we might call a spirituality of leadership. So that's a little bit my agenda. And I'm going to talk about, I don't know if I will get to all four of these ideas because of our time, but let's see where we go. The first thing, when you have a time of great change, you need to create a culture where everyone is leading, that each person understands their opportunity and responsibility. Because when there's a lot of complexity, a lot of change, this old stereotype where one person can sit in a corner office in New York City or Rome and decide or understand or figure out every challenge, it simply will never work. So one of our challenges is, could we create a culture, a sense where all of our congregation members, all of our lay colleagues, all of our teachers, all of our nurses, whatever our ministries, they could somehow understand, yes, I too am part of the leadership project. And this will not be mentally the way they think. Because when we say the word leadership, automatically people think of who is the boss, who is the general superior, who is the executive director. So we must help them to understand how they too could see themselves as having a leadership responsibility. And the two ways I would emphasize that would be first, to go back to the dictionary definition I raised earlier, that leadership has something to do with pointing the way and influencing others. And maybe the general superior or the school principal points out the way in some public formal fashion, but isn't it true that in an implicit sense, each of us is pointing the way and having influence by virtue of what values we role model, how we treat other people, how we use our time, how we treat the colleagues, how we treat the students, and so on. So the first idea I want to convey is, could we, in this time of great change, help everybody who is on the journey with us to appreciate, yes, we each share leadership in our own way. Not that we all have the same authority, but we all in some way must be pointing the same direction together, helping the organization move together, or we'll never make it. And these next couple of slides I will go through fairly quickly. They are underscoring this idea of everyone leads. This first one, you can read it to yourself afterward if you wish to get the slides. It's just underscoring from a piece of research the importance of what I said, that in times of VUCA, you really need to emphasize good leadership. So 80% of people, corporations who responded to this survey said that leadership is a really high priority. Only 40% said that they think their organizations are ready. So whether we are talking about Banco Santander or JP Morgan or any organization on earth, including your own congregations and ministries, there's this imperative to emphasize leadership. And Pablo, we can go to the next slide. And you know, when we say to our colleagues, we need you to show leadership, they will think intuitively, as I just said, they will think, no, 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 I'm not the leader. I'm not the principal. I'm not the general superior. But look at what this piece of research from McKinsey, again, corporate customers, indicates. They interviewed their corporate clients about what are some of the behaviors that they associate with effective leadership in an organization. And look at this list. I won't read it for you, but I suspect you would agree with me that, oh yeah, these are qualities that people at all levels can manifest, most of them. And I suspect that you would also agree that you could connect some of these qualities to the priorities or values or charisms of your congregation or institute. In other words, giving praise, fostering respect, being supportive. Those are not religious phrases, but I think you could very easily make the connection between these ideas and what's important in terms of what the kinds of behaviors you want within your institute. So I'm in this slide both trying to underscore how people at all levels might show leadership, and also underscore how we could understand leadership as somehow a deeply spiritual endeavor. If you want to reduce this whole page of ideas to a much simpler way of thinking, let's go, we're going to skip a slide, Pablo. Let's skip this one. Yeah. So here is a quote I found in an interview with an American, a US American football coach. And he was asked to describe how he conceptually understood his job. And look what he says. Every day when I go to work, I think about the things I could do to make my team successful. So I have a servant's mentality in terms of how I approach my job. Let me make 2 or 3 observations. One, notice this idea of could we get a team of people, whether they're the boss or some individual contributor, coming to work thinking not first about themselves, but first about how can I help make others successful? And I think we would all also be able to trace an idea like this to our own charisms. In other words, we are not about putting ourselves first. We're about purpose greater than self, mission greater than self. And look at this American football player. He's not giving a religious commentary. He's talking about his own sport enterprise, but he's talking in a deeply spiritual way. And in fact, look at his second sentence. I have a servant's mentality in terms of how I approach my job. And this word servant, I think, would resonate with a lot of us. Pope Francis talks a lot about servant leadership. I know in many of your congregations you do as well. And this very simple way of understanding servant as, yeah, it's my job to serve the team in the sense of trying to make everybody else successful, or to use a very Catholic word, helping others to flourish. Next slide, Pablo. I won't spend much time, but just to give you another example of a very simple phrase that can encapsulate how we can help people at all levels to internalize what our spirituality of leadership might be. This is the former COO of Facebook. She's certainly not talking as a religious or spiritual person, but look at the spiritual dimensions of what she says. Leadership is about making others better as a result of your presence and making sure that impact lasts in your absence. And just think, whatever are your key ministries, whether it's education, healthcare, human services, social services, if people could say this about our ministries, we're making others better as a result of our presence, how proud we would be. So the first big imperative in a time of VUCA, big change, is could we find a way of helping everybody on the team to appreciate that they also have some sort of leadership opportunity and responsibility. The next slide will now move on to another really important imperative during leadership, this second dot point. If things are changing a lot, we need to be more innovative, because the world is not going to stop changing around us. And for sure, our core beliefs, our core charism, our core dogmatic beliefs as Catholics won't change, but we sure are going to have to change many other aspects of our operation if we're going to be able to adapt to a world that has changed around us. And here again, I think our religious congregations, our traditions, are giving us some very powerful tools. And I know that the whole focus of the Discerning Leadership program is around being able to make good choices in times of change. So I don't need to explain this in detail. This is what you've worked through already in detail. But let me put it in my own frame, the way I might explain it, for example, to business people. It will be another way for you to appreciate how you could think about your gifts, the gifts of some of our religious traditions around inner freedom in the face of change and big decisions. So let's go to the next slide. And Pope Francis encourages us to be open to change. We're not living in an era of change, but a change of era. Assume always the spirit of the great explorers, that on the sea we're passionate for navigation and not frightened. May it be a free church and open to the challenges of the present, never in defense for fear of losing something. And you know very well, sometimes people misunderstand when the Pope says free, he's referring to our inner freedom to be able and willing to go where the Spirit goes. Or, as I sometimes explain it to business people, for example, on the next slide, Pablo, I tell them, you have to unload your inner baggage. If you want to have any hope of making good, effective, moral, change adaptive decisions. And what sometimes happens in the organizational context, certainly in the business context that I am most aware of, what happens is that people have all of the data they need, all of the information, all of the legal support, all of the financial analysis. So in terms of the external material to make a good choice, they have everything they need. But they often, nonetheless, make terrible decisions because of the internal factors. In our spiritual language, they are not free. In my colloquial language, they are unable to unload their inner baggage that's getting in the way of good choices. And when I say inner baggage or inner freedom, I'm talking about the kinds of things that are on the next slide, Pablo. One of Ignatius of Loyola's great contributions and insights is this need to attain inner freedom when we face important choices. And some of the things that get us into trouble when we face a changing world may be the fear of trying anything new or of taking a risk, the impulse, we get attached to the impulse to do what other people are doing. We get attached to the ways we've always done it before. Or in a discussion, a debate, a discernment, we get attached to our own need to be in control or to win, to have our idea prevail. Next comes a classic one from Ignatius. We are at some subtle level that we may not be aware of consciously, attached to our own status needs, our greed, our power or ego issues. Or the last one, a classic one in all organizations nowadays, the fear of making a choice when the future or the correct answer may not be 100% clear. And the reality of the current VUCA world is that the future is almost never 100% clear. So a second imperative for leading well in a time of VUCA is to be able to be a good, innovative, creative decision maker And our spiritual traditions are giving us great tools to help us to do that. Let's quickly look at a last idea, and then we'll have another discussion. Go back, you could go to the previous, perfect, right there, Pablo. So another imperative in a time of VUCA is to keep ourselves recollected amidst the chaos or craziness that is happening all day, every day. And when I talk to a lay organization, I might use the image that you see on this slide of a pit stop. I say to them, well, no Formula One driver would be so crazy as to try to drive a 500-mile race without stopping for fuel, engine check tires. But metaphorically, too many of us are living our ministry life, our work life, our daily life like a crazy Formula One driver. We're going all day and never stopping. And you see these simple dot points that encapsulate the main steps of an Ignatian examen, but your own institutes no doubt have your own ways, whether it's liturgy of the hours or other tools that encourage you to stop each day and take stock. And we do these things, of course, for religious purposes. But I want to point out that they also have these wonderful leadership benefits, because many of us, every day, we're floating along on this river of email, phone call, text, distraction. We get to the end of the workday, we've never come to grips with our number one priority. Or we've been 100% present to every random, unimportant distraction that's crossed our radar. What we have not been in touch with at all is what ultimately is most important. What's going on deep inside us and our relationship with our Creator. So in times of big change, of VUCA, we need to have some mechanisms to step back every day and get on track. And our spiritual tradition is giving us great tools to help us to do that. Some competitive advantage, if you will. Here is El Greco's painting of the moment in the upper room with the Holy Spirit. And, you know, much of the way I spoke was in a kind of a humanistic way, so to speak, about many of these qualities. But at the end of the day, nothing is possible of the ideas I shared without courage, and courage doesn't come from us, huh? And I've often thought that for the church at large and for many of our ministries, this is an upper room moment, you know, and we remember those disciples gathering in the upper room, afraid, not clear, what should we do, confused. And really it's God's Holy Spirit that ultimately encourages them and shows the way. And so I shared many ideas, but frankly, the most important idea is the last one, that I do think we're in what we could call an upper room moment here. And we really need to call God's Spirit into our midst all the time to help us to understand the next steps of the way and to give us the courage to take the next steps and do some of those human actions that I shared in other points. So thank you very much for all your thoughts. And I think, David, you will help to close us, will you?
Yes, thanks, Chris. First of all, as we're closing, I invite you to, in the chat, first find an article that you may find interesting and helpful. I just posted. It's one that I wrote with a co-author on this topic of leading in turbulent times, and it very much helps to follow up on many of the things that Chris has introduced. Secondly, I'd like to introduce the invitation, if you would, to write briefly in the chat something that you're taking away from the conversation that you'd like to represent back to Chris, just as a form of appreciation. What's one thing that for you has really been an important takeaway from this time together and that you'd like to reflect back? Finally, I'm going to invite you, as you're doing that, also to pay attention to the last slide in the presentation. And Pablo, I wonder if you could share that. Okay, there we go. So as you may know, Chris is a really wonderful author. He writes with the same kind of clarity and very engaging style that he speaks. And the first book he's most well known for is the one, Heroic Leadership, looking at these four pillars of the Jesuit tradition and our spirituality and the way that they've influenced our effectiveness over time. And it's a helpful book, I think, to reflect on your own charisms and the connections to the virtues that you find in your own spiritualities. His book on Pope Francis is wonderful and has many vignettes about Francis that you might find interesting. The book Heroic Living is like a follow-up to Heroic Leadership, and it's wonderful to use with colleagues, lay colleagues, who are interested in understanding how to translate the charism into their daily lives. And then finally, if you're interested in thinking about the implications of synodality for leadership in your organizations and the way that everybody, in fact, is not only invited but necessary to lead these days, this most recent book is a wonderful addition there. So thanks, Pablo. If you have seen that, we'll go back to the last slide or to the last screen, seeing us all. Chris, you're seeing lots of nice comments there, and we will share with you the chat so that you can keep that. But sincere thanks to you for your time, for your preparation, and for the way that you're kind of translating your rich experience as an offering to us. We thank you so much.